Jake Morrison had seen plenty of tough situations in his 32 years working ranches across Texas, but nothing quite like this. The sun was setting behind the rocky hills of Devil's Canyon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape where he now found himself trapped. His horse, Thunder, lay motionless nearby, a victim of the rattlesnake bite that had sent the animal into a panic just hours earlier. The fall from Thunder's back had been brutal. Jake's right leg was pinned beneath a massive boulder that had shifted during the rockslide triggered by his horse's frantic movements. The pain shot through his body like lightning every time he tried to move, but he knew staying still meant certain death in this remote corner of the desert. "I can't endure this much longer," Jake muttered through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. He had been trapped for nearly 4 hours, and his water supply was running dangerously low. The nearest ranch was 15 miles away, and nobody knew where he had gone. He had been tracking strays from the Henderson Ranch, a job that should have been routine. Jake tried once more to shift the boulder, pushing against it with both hands while attempting to pull his leg free. The rock was easily 3 times his weight, and each effort sent waves of agony through his trapped limb. He could feel the circulation being cut off, and his boot was beginning to feel uncomfortably tight. The cowboy had always prided himself on his problem-solving abilities. Growing up on his father's ranch in Montana, he had learned that panic was a luxury no rancher could afford. Cattle got spooked, equipment broke down, and storms came without warning. A man survived by keeping his head clear and thinking through every option. But this situation was different. Jake examined the boulder carefully, running his calloused hands along its surface to find any weakness or leverage point. The rock was granite, smooth from years of wind and rain. It had settled into the sandy ground in such a way that it formed a perfect trap around his leg, just above the ankle. Thunder's labored breathing reminded Jake that time was running out for both of them. The horse was suffering from the venom, and Jake knew that even if he could free himself, Thunder might not survive the night. The thought of losing his companion of 8 years added emotional weight to his physical struggle. As darkness began to fall, Jake noticed something that gave him a spark of hope. About 20 feet away, partially hidden behind a cluster of prickly pear cactus, was an old piece of mining equipment. It looked like a crowbar or pry bar, probably left behind by prospectors who had worked this area decades ago. The problem was obvious: he couldn't reach it while trapped under the boulder. Jake looked around for anything within his reach that might help. His lariat was still attached to his belt, and his saddlebags had spilled open when Thunder fell. Among the scattered contents, he could see jerky, a spare horseshoe, some leather strips, and his emergency medical kit. Jake began formulating a plan. Using his lariat, he might be able to loop it around the crowbar and drag it closer. The angle would be difficult, and he would need to be accurate with his throw. His shoulder was bruised from the fall, making precise movements painful. The first attempt fell short by several feet. The rope landed near the cactus but couldn't reach the metal bar. Jake coiled the rope again, taking time to ignore the increasing pain in his trapped leg. He needed to make the throw count because his strength was beginning to fade. On his third try, the loop of the lariat caught the end of the crowbar. Jake carefully pulled it closer, fighting against the rough terrain that wanted to snag the rope. After several minutes of patient maneuvering, he finally had the tool in his hands. The crowbar was old and rusted, but it felt solid. Jake positioned it against the boulder, searching for the best angle to apply leverage. The physics were challenging because he couldn't get proper positioning while lying on his back with his leg trapped. After several attempts to find the right fulcrum point, Jake realized he would need to create one. Using rocks within his reach, he built a small pile that would serve as a pivot point for the crowbar. The work was slow and exhausting, and each movement sent fresh waves of pain through his injured leg. As he worked, Jake's mind wandered to his girlfriend Sarah, who was waiting for him back in town. They had talked about marriage, about starting their own ranch together. She would be expecting him for dinner tomorrow night, and when he didn't show up, she would know something was wrong. But would anyone think to look for him in Devil's Canyon? The desert night was getting colder, and Jake knew he needed to work faster. Hypothermia was a real danger, especially with his body already weakened by pain and dehydration. He pulled his jacket tighter and continued arranging rocks to create his leverage system. Thunder's breathing was becoming more shallow and irregular. Jake glanced over at his faithful horse and made a silent promise that he would get them both out of this situation. Thunder had carried him through countless roundups, river crossings, and long nights on the trail. The horse deserved better than dying in this forsaken canyon. With his improvised fulcrum finally in place, Jake positioned the crowbar under the edge of the boulder. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was the best he could manage given his limited mobility. He tested the leverage gently, feeling the rock shift slightly. It was going to take every ounce of strength he had left. Jake gripped the crowbar with both hands, took a deep breath, and began to apply pressure. The boulder moved a fraction of an inch, just enough to give him hope. But the effort required was enormous, and he could feel his muscles trembling with the strain. "Come on," he whispered to himself, pushing harder against the metal bar. "Just a little more." The rock shifted again, this time noticeably. Jake could feel some of the pressure relieving from his leg, though it was still firmly trapped. He adjusted his grip and tried again, this time putting his entire body weight into the effort. Suddenly, the crowbar slipped from its position and clanged against the boulder uselessly. Jake's hands were scraped and bleeding from the rough metal, and his shoulder felt like it might be dislocated. The boulder had settled back into its original position, perhaps even more firmly than before. Exhausted and discouraged, Jake lay back against the sandy ground and stared up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The Milky Way was visible out here, far from any city lights, and for a moment he allowed himself to appreciate the beauty of the desert night despite his dire circumstances. But appreciation wouldn't save his life or Thunder's. Jake forced himself to sit up and examine his situation again. There had to be another way, another angle he hadn't considered. His father had always said that giving up was the only real failure, that every problem had a solution if you were willing to look hard enough. As he studied the boulder in the growing moonlight, Jake noticed something he had missed before. On the far side of the rock, there was a natural crack running through the granite. It was narrow, barely visible, but it represented a potential weakness in the stone. The crack was too far from his current position to reach with the crowbar, but maybe he could create enough leverage to exploit it. Jake began gathering more rocks, building a more sophisticated fulcrum system that would allow him to apply force at a different angle. The work was painstaking and exhausting. Every few minutes, he had to stop and rest, fighting against the dizziness that came from blood loss and dehydration. His trapped leg had gone from painful to numb, which worried him almost more than the pain had. By the time he had finished constructing his new leverage system, it was nearly midnight. The desert was now genuinely cold, and Jake was shivering despite his jacket. He knew that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. If he couldn't free himself soon, the cold and dehydration would finish what the boulder had started. Jake positioned the crowbar against his new fulcrum and aimed for the crack in the boulder. This time, he would have only one real chance. His strength was nearly gone, and if this attempt failed, he might not have enough energy for another. He gripped the metal bar firmly, said a quiet prayer to whatever forces might be listening in this empty desert, and began to apply pressure against the boulder. This time, instead of trying to move the entire rock, he was targeting its weakest point. The strain was incredible, and Jake felt something pop in his shoulder. But the crack in the boulder was beginning to widen. He could hear the granite creaking and groaning as stress built up along the fault line. Press deeper, Jake told himself, pushing beyond what he thought his body could handle. Don't stop now. The crack suddenly expanded with a sharp report that echoed off the canyon walls. The boulder didn't move dramatically, but it shifted just enough for Jake to feel his leg come free. He pulled his limb out from under the rock and immediately rolled away, gasping with relief and exhaustion. For several minutes, Jake simply lay on the sandy ground, grateful to be free but too weak to celebrate. His leg was badly bruised and possibly broken, but he could move it. More importantly, he was no longer trapped. Thunder nickered weakly from nearby, reminding Jake that his ordeal was far from over. He was free from the boulder, but he was still 15 miles from help with an injured leg and a dying horse. The night was getting colder, and he had used most of his remaining energy escaping the trap. Jake forced himself to sit up and take inventory of his situation. His leg was damaged but functional. His water was nearly gone. Thunder was fading fast from the snakebite. And he was still in one of the most remote and dangerous parts of the Texas desert. But he was alive, and he was free. That was a start. Now he needed to figure out how to stay that way. Jake struggled to his feet, testing his injured leg carefully. The pain was sharp but manageable, and he could put weight on it without collapsing. His ankle was swollen tight against his boot, but nothing seemed broken. He had been lucky, considering how long he had been trapped under that massive boulder. Thunder was in much worse condition. The horse lay on his side, breathing in short, labored gasps. The rattlesnake bite on his front leg had swollen grotesquely, and the venom was clearly affecting his entire system. Jake knelt beside his longtime companion, running his hand along Thunder's neck. "Easy, boy," Jake whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of strain and dehydration. "We're going to get through this together." But, even as he spoke the comforting words, Jake knew the truth. Thunder was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The nearest veterinarian was in town, over 15 miles away, and even if Jake could somehow transport the horse that distance, it might already be too late. Jake opened his medical kit and found a small bottle of pain medication intended for humans. He had no idea if it would help Thunder or potentially make things worse. After a moment of consideration, he decided to save it. Thunder was beyond help from anything in a basic first aid kit, and Jake might need the medication himself before this ordeal was over. The cowboy gathered his scattered belongings, salvaging what he could from the aftermath of Thunder's fall. His saddle was damaged but still functional. Most of his food had survived the tumble, though his water situation remained critical. He had perhaps 2 swallows left in his canteen, hardly enough to see him through the night, much less the journey back to civilization. As Jake sorted through his gear, he found his emergency signal mirror buried beneath some leather straps. The small device was designed to reflect sunlight to attract attention from aircraft or distant observers. It would be useless until dawn, but it gave him hope for the morning. He also recovered his compass and a basic map of the region. Studying the map by moonlight, Jake confirmed what he already suspected: he was in the most isolated part of Devil's Canyon, at least 12 miles from the nearest road. The terrain between his current position and safety was rough and dangerous, especially for a man traveling on foot with an injured leg. Thunder's breathing became more irregular, and Jake realized his faithful horse didn't have much time left. The thought of leaving Thunder alone in this desolate place was almost unbearable, but Jake knew he had to think practically. If he stayed with Thunder until the end, he might miss his own chance for survival. Jake made his decision. He would travel through the night while the cooler temperatures made walking more bearable. His injured leg would slow him down, but he could cover several miles before dawn if he paced himself properly. When the sun came up, he would use the signal mirror to try to attract attention from any aircraft that might pass overhead. Before leaving, Jake spent a few minutes with Thunder, speaking softly to the horse that had been his constant companion through so many adventures. He told Thunder about the good times they had shared, the cattle drives, the river crossings, the peaceful evenings on the range. It was his way of saying goodbye. "You've been the best partner a cowboy could ask for," Jake whispered, stroking Thunder's mane one final time. "I'll never forget you, boy." Jake shouldered his damaged saddle and began the long walk toward safety. Every step sent a jolt of pain through his injured leg, but he forced himself to maintain a steady pace. The desert night was cold but clear, with enough moonlight to illuminate his path through the rocky terrain. The first hour of walking was the hardest. Jake's body was still recovering from the trauma of being trapped, and his leg muscles were stiff and uncooperative. But, gradually, he found his rhythm. The pain became a constant companion rather than a sharp distraction, and he was able to focus on navigation and conserving his energy. Jake had learned desert survival from his grandfather, an old-timer who had worked cattle drives across some of the harshest country in the Southwest. The key was to move steadily but not exhaust yourself, to conserve body moisture, and to never panic no matter how bad things looked. As he walked, Jake kept his mind occupied by planning his route and thinking about what he would do when he reached safety. Sarah would be worried sick by now, probably calling every ranch in 3 counties looking for him. His boss at the Henderson Ranch would organize search parties at first light. Jake just had to survive long enough for help to find him. The terrain was treacherous in the darkness. Jake had to pick his way carefully around boulder fields and across loose rock slides. Several times he nearly stepped on rattlesnakes that were still active in the cooling night air. His injured leg made it difficult to maintain proper balance, and he had to use his rope as a walking stick to help steady himself. After 3 hours of steady walking, Jake allowed himself a brief rest. He had covered perhaps 4 miles, putting him roughly 8 miles from the main road. His leg was throbbing, and his throat was parched from dehydration, but he was making progress. Jake rationed himself one tiny sip from his nearly empty canteen, just enough to moisten his mouth. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it was the most precious thing he owned at that moment. He would save the rest for an emergency, though he wasn't sure what could constitute more of an emergency than his current situation. The night sky was beginning to show the first faint hints of gray in the east when Jake encountered his biggest obstacle yet. A steep-sided arroyo cut across his path, too wide to jump and too deep to climb down and up again with his injured leg. The dry creek bed stretched in both directions as far as he could see in the dim light. Jake studied the situation carefully. He could follow the arroyo either upstream or downstream, looking for a place where the banks were low enough to cross. But that would add miles to his journey, and he wasn't sure his leg would hold out for the extra distance. There was another option, though it was dangerous. About 50 yards to his left, a large dead tree had fallen across the arroyo, forming a natural bridge. The trunk was thick enough to walk on, but it was at least 20 feet above the rocky bottom of the creek bed. If he fell, the injury would likely be fatal. Jake examined the fallen tree more closely. The bark was weathered, but the wood appeared solid. There were enough branches and knots on the surface to provide decent footing, at least for the first part of the crossing. The middle section was smooth and would require careful balance. After weighing his options, Jake decided to attempt the crossing. The alternative was hours of additional walking that might leave him still short of safety when the desert heat became unbearable. He needed to reach help before the sun got too high. Jake removed his boots and socks, knowing that his bare feet would provide better grip on the weathered wood. He tied the boots to his belt and carefully climbed up to where the fallen trunk rested against the bank of the arroyo. The first few steps were manageable. The trunk was wide enough that Jake could walk normally, using his arms for balance. But, as he approached the middle of the span, the going became more difficult. The wood was smooth here, polished by years of wind and occasional flash floods. Halfway across, Jake's injured leg cramped suddenly, nearly sending him tumbling into the rocky creek bed below. He dropped to his hands and knees, straddling the trunk until the spasm passed. The position was precarious but safer than trying to stand on one good leg. From his new vantage point, Jake could see that the rest of the crossing would have to be done carefully. The trunk sagged slightly in the middle, and there were no good handholds for the final 10 feet. He would have to crawl the rest of the way, moving slowly and deliberately. The process was exhausting and nerve-wracking. Every few feet, Jake had to stop and rest, fighting against the dizziness that came from dehydration and fatigue. The rocky bottom of the arroyo seemed to reach up toward him, waiting for any mistake. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Jake reached the far side of the arroyo. He collapsed onto solid ground, breathing heavily and shaking from the adrenaline. His hands were scraped raw from gripping the rough bark, and his injured leg was screaming in protest, but he had made it across. Jake pulled his boots back on and checked his position on the map. The crossing had actually saved him time by allowing him to maintain his direct route toward the road. He was now perhaps 5 miles from safety, close enough that he might encounter early morning traffic if he could reach the highway. The sky was definitely getting lighter now, though sunrise was still an hour away. Jake could make out more details of the landscape around him, which was both helpful for navigation and discouraging in terms of the distance he still had to cover. As he resumed walking, Jake began to notice signs that he was moving out of the deep desert and into areas that saw more human activity. There were old tire tracks, probably from hunters or prospectors, and scattered pieces of trash that indicated people occasionally passed through this area. The most encouraging sign was a line of wooden fence posts running roughly parallel to his intended route. The fence was old and many of the posts were broken or leaning, but it represented the boundary of some rancher's property. Where there were fences, there were usually roads not far away. Jake followed the fence line, using it as a guide towards civilization. His pace had slowed considerably as fatigue and pain took their toll, but he was still moving forward. Every step brought him closer to safety and further from the desolate canyon where Thunder lay dying. As the sun finally appeared over the horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and red, Jake caught sight of something that made his heart race with hope. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, he could see a thin line of telephone poles marching across the desert floor. Telephone poles meant a road, and a road meant the possibility of traffic. Even if no vehicles passed by, Jake could follow the road to the nearest ranch or town. He had found his path to salvation. But 2 miles might as well have been 20 in his current condition. Jake's injured leg was barely supporting his weight, and he was beginning to show serious signs of dehydration. His head was pounding, his vision was getting blurry, and his mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. Jake forced himself to take another tiny sip from his canteen, leaving just a few drops for a final emergency. The warm water provided minimal relief, but it was better than nothing. He had to reach that road before the desert heat became unbearable and finished what the boulder had started. The sun was climbing rapidly now, and Jake could already feel its heat beginning to build. In a few hours, the temperature would soar well above 100 degrees, making travel on foot extremely dangerous for someone in his weakened condition. Jake gritted his teeth, shouldered his gear one more time, and began the final push toward the distant road. Behind him, Devil's Canyon held the body of his faithful horse and the memory of the longest night of his life. Ahead lay either rescue or a different kind of death under the merciless desert sun. The desert heat was building rapidly as Jake stumbled toward the distant road. Each step had become an act of pure willpower, his injured leg barely able to support his weight. The telephone poles seemed to mock him, appearing no closer despite his painful progress across the rocky terrain. Jake's vision began playing tricks on him. Mirages shimmered in the distance, creating the illusion of water where none existed. Once, he thought he saw Thunder running toward him across the desert floor, healthy and strong. But when he blinked, there was nothing but empty sand and scattered sagebrush. The sun was now high enough to make the rocks uncomfortably hot to touch. Jake knew that within another hour, the surface temperature would become dangerous for exposed skin. His dark clothing was already absorbing heat at an alarming rate, and sweat was beginning to flow freely from his body, depleting his precious remaining fluids. Halfway to the road, Jake's injured leg finally gave out completely. He collapsed onto the sandy ground, gasping for breath and fighting against waves of nausea. His body was shutting down, and he knew that if he stayed down for long, he might never get up again. Jake forced himself to examine his options realistically. He was still over a mile from the road, farther than he could crawl in his current condition. The temperature was rising rapidly, and he had no water left except for a few drops in the bottom of his canteen. Without immediate help, he would not survive another hour in the open desert. That was when Jake remembered the signal mirror in his pack. He pulled out the small device and angled it toward the sun, creating a brilliant flash of reflected light. If there was any aircraft in the area, or if someone with binoculars happened to be watching from the road, the signal might be visible for miles. Jake began flashing the mirror in the international distress pattern, 3 quick flashes, 3 long flashes, 3 quick flashes. Over and over he repeated the SOS signal, sweeping the mirror across the sky to cover as much territory as possible. His arms ached from holding the device steady, but he didn't dare stop. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, Jake heard something that made his heart leap with hope. It was the distant sound of an engine, growing gradually louder. Not an airplane, but a vehicle traveling along the road he had been trying to reach. Jake angled his mirror toward the sound and flashed desperately in that direction. The engine noise was getting closer, but he couldn't tell if the driver had seen his signal. The vehicle seemed to be moving at normal highway speed, not slowing down as it would if someone had spotted him. In desperation, Jake tried to stand so he could wave his arms and make himself more visible. But his injured leg buckled immediately, sending him crashing back to the ground with a cry of pain that echoed across the empty desert. The engine sound was beginning to fade now, moving away from him along the distant road. Jake felt tears of frustration and despair rolling down his cheeks as his last chance for rescue disappeared into the morning heat. He had come so close, only to fail when salvation was within reach. But then, something unexpected happened. The engine sound changed, becoming louder again instead of fading away. The vehicle had stopped and was now turning around, coming back in his direction. Someone had seen his signal after all. Jake continued flashing the mirror frantically, no longer following any pattern but simply creating as much reflected light as possible. The sound of the engine was definitely getting closer now, and he could make out the rumble of a heavy truck rather than a passenger car. From his position on the desert floor, Jake couldn't see the road clearly, but he could hear the vehicle stopping somewhere in the distance. Then came the sound of doors slamming and voices calling out. Someone was looking for him, probably following the direction of his signal flashes. "Over here!" Jake tried to shout, but his voice came out as barely more than a croak. His throat was too dry and damaged from dehydration to produce much sound. He continued flashing the mirror and tried to wave one arm weakly above his head. The voices were getting closer now, and Jake could make out individual words. Someone was calling his name, which meant these weren't just good Samaritans who had happened to spot his distress signal. This was an organized search party that had been looking specifically for him. "Jake Morrison! Where are you?" The voice belonged to Bill Henderson, his boss from the ranch. Jake tried again to shout a response, managing only a weak whisper that wouldn't carry more than a few feet. But the searchers were systematic and determined. Jake could hear them spreading out, calling back and forth to coordinate their search pattern. It was only a matter of time before they found him, and, indeed, within a few minutes he heard footsteps approaching through the scrub brush. "Found him," someone yelled, and suddenly, Jake was surrounded by familiar faces. Bill Henderson was there, along with two other cowboys from the ranch and a man Jake didn't recognize who was carrying a medical bag. A doctor or paramedic from town, most likely. "Easy there, Jake," Bill said, kneeling beside him in the sand. "You look like hell, but you're alive. That's what matters." The medical man was already examining Jake's injuries, checking his pulse and looking at his swollen leg. "Severe dehydration," he announced. "Possible heat exhaustion. This leg needs attention, but nothing looks life-threatening. We got here just in time." Jake tried to explain about thunder, about the rattlesnake and the boulder, but the words wouldn't come out clearly. The doctor was already preparing in 4-bag, telling the others they needed to get Jake to the truck immediately and start replacing his lost fluids. "Don't try to talk right now," Bill said gently. "Sarah's been worried sick about you. She called us when you didn't show up for dinner last night, and we've been searching since first light. Your signal mirror probably saved your life. We were about to head back to town and expand the search area when Tommy spotted the flashes." The cowboys fashioned a makeshift stretcher using Jake's damaged saddle and some rope from the truck. The short journey to the vehicle was painful for Jake's injured leg, but it was the most welcome pain he had ever experienced. Every bump and jostle meant he was getting closer to safety and medical care. The truck was an old ranch pickup with a radio antenna, and Bill immediately called ahead to the hospital to let them know they were coming in with an injured man. Jake could hear the relief in Sarah's voice crackling through the radio static when Bill confirmed that they had found him alive. As they loaded Jake into the truck bed, he managed to grab Bill's arm weakly. "Thunder," he whispered through cracked lips. "Still out there. Devil's Canyon." Bill nodded grimly. "We'll send someone for him, Jake. Don't worry about that now. Just concentrate on getting better." The ride to town was a blur of pain and relief. The 4 fluids were already making Jake feel more human, though his leg throbbed with every bump in the rough road. The doctor monitored his vital signs and assured the others that Jake would make a full recovery with proper treatment and rest. Jake dozed fitfully during the hour-long drive, his exhausted body finally allowing itself to relax now that he was safe. In his semi-conscious state, he dreamed about Thunder running free across green pastures, young and strong again, no longer suffering from the venom that had killed him in that desolate canyon. When they reached the hospital, Jake was immediately wheeled into the emergency room where a full medical team was waiting. Sarah was there too, her face streaked with tears as she squeezed his hand and told him how frightened she had been when he didn't come home. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, stroking his hair as the doctors and nurses worked around them. "When Bill said you were missing in Devil's Canyon, I didn't know what to think. That place has such a terrible reputation." Jake squeezed her hand weakly, still unable to speak clearly but wanting her to know that he was going to be all right. The worst was over now. He had faced death in one of the most hostile environments on Earth and had found a way to survive through determination and a little bit of luck. The doctors confirmed that Jake's leg was badly bruised but not broken. His ankle was sprained and would need several weeks to heal properly. The dehydration was serious but responding well to treatment. Most importantly, there was no permanent damage from his ordeal. As Jake lay in his hospital bed later that day, properly hydrated and with his leg elevated and bandaged, Bill Henderson stopped by to give him an update on the search for Thunder. They had found the horse exactly where Jake had described, and the veterinarian had confirmed that the rattlesnake bite had been fatal. Thunder had died peacefully, probably not long after Jake had left him. "He was a good horse," Bill said quietly. "One of the best I ever saw. I'm sorry we couldn't save him, Jake." Jake nodded, accepting the loss with the stoicism that came naturally to men who worked with animals. Thunder had lived a good life and had died doing what he loved best, carrying his rider across the open range. There were worse ways for a horse to go. The story of Jake's survival spread quickly through the ranching community. Other cowboys stopped by the hospital to hear firsthand about his night trapped under the boulder and his desperate walk to safety. The tale grew slightly with each telling, as such stories do, but the core facts remained impressive enough without embellishment. Jake Morrison had faced impossible odds in one of the harshest environments on the continent and had refused to give up. When the boulder had trapped him, he had found a way to free himself. When Thunder had died, he had continued on foot despite his injuries. When dehydration and heat had threatened to kill him, he had used his wits and his signaling mirror to attract rescue. Most importantly, he had never allowed despair to overcome his determination to survive. Even in his darkest moments, when death had seemed certain, Jake had continued to fight and to think and to move toward safety. That was the true lesson of his ordeal, that the human spirit could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances through courage, intelligence, and sheer refusal to surrender. 3 weeks later, Jake was back on his feet and preparing to return to work. His leg was still weak but functional, and the doctors had cleared him for light duty. Sarah had agreed to marry him, saying that his survival had shown her how precious life was and how important it was not to waste time on unnecessary delays. On his first day back at the Henderson Ranch, Bill presented Jake with a new horse, a young sorrel gelding with good bloodlines and a gentle disposition. The horse would never replace Thunder in Jake's heart, but he represented a new beginning and the continuation of a cowboy's life on the range. Jake named the horse Spirit, in honor of the determination that had carried him through his trial in Devil's Canyon. As he swung into the saddle for the first time in nearly a month, Jake felt a familiar sense of rightness settle over him. This was where he belonged, on horseback, under the open sky, doing the work that his grandfather and great-grandfather had done before him. The desert had tested Jake Morrison and found him worthy. He had faced its worst challenges and had emerged stronger and more confident than ever. Devil's Canyon would always hold painful memories, but it had also proven to Jake that he possessed the courage and resourcefulness to overcome any obstacle that life might place in his path.